Okay, today we're talking about dividing rational numbers. This is chapter 3, lesson 4. So all of the properties of integers also apply to rational numbers. The statement 1/4 times 4 equals 1 demonstrates another property. Two numbers whose product is 1 are called multiplicative inverses. So two numbers whose product is 1. Or another word for them are reciprocals. So taking a look at the symbols here, we're looking at, for every number, a over b, that rational number right there, where b, remember, can never equal 0. There's exactly one number, which they have here, b over a, such that the reciprocal, or that multiplicative inverse, is always going to equal a positive 1. So here in the example, they have 2/3 times 3/2, which is its reciprocal, equals 1. So in these directions, it says find the multiplicative inverse of each number. If I take 7/16 and I write that reciprocal, or I find that multiplicative inverse, 16 over 7, I know that that product has to equal a positive 1. Well, 7 times 16, let me grab my calculator really quick, sorry. 7 times 16 gives me 112. And 16 times 7 on the denominator gives me 112. And we know that that equals a positive 1. So the multiplicative inverse of 7/16 is 16 over 7. Over here on the right for b, I know that the first job I need to do is find, or actually convert that mixed number into an improper fraction. In order to do that, I take my whole, which is 6, and I multiply it by my denominator, which is 3, leaving me with 18 as the product. I then know that I take my numerator and I add that to whatever product I get, which gives me 19, okay? Because my denominator is 3, that denominator still carries over here, and I have my negative symbol, which I cannot forget about. So, negative 19/3 is actually what negative 6 and 1/3 means. So how am I going to find the multiplicative inverse of that? Well, I multiply by negative 3/19, and those should come out to equal a positive 1. Now, because we have a negative and a negative that are being multiplied together, we know that those create a positive. So I'm good there. And I know that 19 times 3 gives us 57, and 3 times 19 gives us 57. And 57 over 57 is 1. Now, when you take a look at this, just because we converted this number right here to negative 19/3, you really need to make sure that you're understanding that this number is this. So when we're taking the reciprocal, or the multiplicative inverse of that, 3/19 would be your answer choice, okay? Now, one thing I do want to point out as well is because we have a negative rational number for b, you need to make sure, be very precise, that you are multiplying by another negative number. Because if we didn't and we multiplied by a positive number, then we would get a negative 1 right here, and we don't want that. All right, so taking a look at the next slide here, they're just showing you, and it might seem confusing to some of you, so if you write them in the notes and you need me to go over them with you, go ahead and feel free to bring those into class. But it says multiplicative inverses are used in division. So we're going to consider 4/9 divided by 3/5, and then we're also going to consider a over b divided by c over d. So here we're just going to multiply that numerator and that denominator by 5/3, okay, because we're multiplying by that reciprocal when we're dividing fractions, because we know that we don't divide fractions. So remember, this is your division symbol there. You've got 4/9 divided by 3/5, and we have to find that multiplicative inverse of 3/5. So here you can see that they're multiplying then by 5/3 on the top and the bottom. And when you do that, these 3's and those 5's cancel, leaving you with just a 1, which is how they're getting that there. And we know that this whole thing, 4/9 times 5/3 divided by 1, is really just the same thing as saying 4/9 times 5/3. So that's just kind of a little bit of logic behind why we don't divide fractions. So anytime you have fractions that you're dividing, make sure that you're multiplying by the reciprocal, okay? Make sure you get the rest of these on the bottom written in your notes, and we'll move on to the next slide. It says find each quotient and then write it in simplest form. Some of us are still forgetting to write everything in simplest form. Always reduce, okay? So again, we don't divide fractions, so I take 1/9 and I have to multiply by this inverse, or this reciprocal, which is 12 over 5. Now, taking a look at 12 over 5 right now, I know some of you had been multiplying your fractions out prior to reducing. It's much easier if you find out what greatest common factor these two have in common, which in this case is 3. 3 goes into 9 3 different times, and 3 goes into 12 4 different times. And now it's much easier for me to just multiply my numerator and denominator. 1 times 4 gives me 4. All over 3 times 5 gives me 15. And 4/15 is my answer for letter A. All right, taking a look at B. Remember, anytime that you have a whole number now, you can go ahead and set that over 1, okay? Because now I've created a numerator and I've created a denominator, so that way it leaves it easy for me to take the reciprocal. So here I write down 3/7, and I know that instead of dividing fractions, I know I multiply by the reciprocal, and so I write 1 over 8 because that is the multiplicative inverse of 8 over 1, and that leaves me with 3 times 1, and there's nothing I can reduce first. 3 times 1 is 3. 7 times 8 is 56. So I know 3/56 is the most reduced or simplest form that that fraction or ratio can be in. All right, let's take a look at this test example here. It says Tessa feeds her dog Roscoe 3 3/4 cups of dog food per day. If she buys a bag of food that contains 165 cups, how many days will the bag of food last? Well, here, your job, you can see, is to divide, right? So let's convert 3 3/4 first into an improper fraction. I know that I take 3, my whole number, and I multiply it by 4, which gives me 12, and then I add anything that's on my numerator, whatever's on my numerator, to give me 15. I know that my denominator still stays the same, which is 4, so 15/4 is my answer, okay? It says if she buys a bag of food that contains 165 cups, how many days will the bag of food last? Okay, so the next thing after let me see, I forget what they say. We know that we have to divide 165 by 3 3/4, and then now you know we already converted, which I think is what they do next. Yep, 15/4, and then they take 165. Remember, set that over 1, so I have 165 over 1, and I know that I don't divide fractions. Instead, I do what? I multiply by the reciprocal. So I take this and I find the reciprocal, which gives me 4/15. And let's see here, 165, does that go into 15 evenly? Yes, it does. So this should go in here 1 time, this should go in here 11 times. And now I can multiply straight across. 11 times 4 gives me 44 over 1, which is the same thing as saying just 44. And always go back to the question. Here they give you multiple choice answers, so you already know what your unit is going to be. But here, if I went back to my test question and I read what they're asking for, it says how many days. So if you weren't given multiple choice, make sure to label that days. Here in the test, you can see that D would be your correct answer choice there. All right, let's move on to the next slide here. So we're going to find 5 over 3AB divided by 15 over ABC, and we're going to write the quotient in simplest form. So remember, we're going to reduce as much as possible. Well, because we have two ratios here, two technically fractions, we do not divide fractions. So we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So my first fraction always stays the same. I have 5 divided by 3AB. And instead of division, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal, that multiplicative inverse, which all you do is you take your denominator and you switch it to your numerator and vice versa. So I've got A, B, C on top, all over 15. Now I know when I am multiplying these kinds of things, remember that this really means 5 times A times B times C, all over 3 times A times B times 15. Before I move on, I know that I can reduce before I multiply anything. I know that 5 goes into 5 once and 5 goes into 15 3 different times. I know that this A and this A can cancel out. This B and this B can cancel out. And it's always a good idea to just circle what you're left with. So I'm left with this, this, and this. So if I multiply everything, and actually technically a 1, I multiply everything on top. 1 times C just gives me a C. All over 3 times 3 gives me a 9. And C over 9 is the answer that we're looking for in the simplest form that it can be in. All right, taking a look on the next slide here, we're going to divide by a mixed number this time. Again, Right now at the beginning of your problem, some of you can look at this and say, hey, I'm dividing a negative by a positive, and I know that when you divide a negative by a positive, I already know that my answer is going to be negative, okay? Because I have an odd number of negatives that I'm dividing together. The next step that we need to do is convert each one of these. So let's convert this mixed number into an improper fraction. So I take my whole number, which is 4, I multiply it by my denominator, which gives me 12, and then I need to add the numerator onto that product to give me a total of 14. Remember, this denominator stays the same, so this is my first ratio that I am dividing. So I have 14 thirds, and I know that I'm going to be multiplying by a reciprocal, but first let's convert 3 and 1/9, okay? So I know that I take 3, which is my whole, and I multiply it by 9, which is my denominator, to give me 27, and I have to add the numerator to that quotient, or that, excuse me, to that product. So 27 plus 1 is going to give me 28, and again, this denominator stays the same, okay? And actually, let's just write this back out like this. So really what this means, these mixed numbers, it means that I have negative 14 thirds divided by 28 ninths. Now, because again, we know we don't divide fractions, I'm going to rewrite this as negative 14 over 3 times the multiplicative inverse, or the reciprocal of this, which is 9 over 28. Now, most of you can look right now and say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and reduce before I multiply. I know 14 goes into 14 once, and it goes into 28 2 times. I also know that 3 goes into 3 once, and it goes into 9 3 times. Again, we already talked about multiplying or dividing a negative by a positive, which is going to give us a negative answer. 1 times 3 gives us 3, and 1 times 2 gives us 2. Again, I can convert that now from an improper fraction to a mixed number. So I get negative 1 and 1/2 as my answer, or as my product now. All right. You can come to class with any questions.